It is the home stretch to Election Day. This week we're discussing the candidates, voter protections, and the last-minute reminders before those final ballots are cast for this midterm election. Hey everybody, and welcome to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson here in Albany. The end is near, and the midterm election is this Tuesday, November 8th. The early voting period, which has been ongoing, ends today. Polls will open at 6 a.m. on Election Day on Tuesday and close at 9 p.m. The deadline to request an absentee ballot has passed, and ballots must be mailed in with a postmark by the 8th. Several House and statewide Senate races are on the ballot. Top at the race for governor, of course, with incumbent Democrat Kathy Hochul facing Republican challenger Congressman Lee Zeldin. All right, joining us now to give us some last-minute reminders for all voters before Election Day is John Conklin with the State Board of Elections. John, thank you for your time.
Happy to be here.
So let's start talking about early voting first. It's been ongoing for the past week. It ends today. How has it been? Has there been a high turnout? What have you seen with early voting so far?
Well, early voting started in 2019, so really the only comparable year we have to compare it to is 2020, which was a presidential year. It was also in the middle of the pandemic, so early voting turnout was very high. It was over 2 million that year. Right now, it's running, I would say, at about 40% of that rate of turnout.
And we've been reminding folks that if they're taking advantage of early voting, to check where that site is, because very often it's different than where they will go on Tuesday, correct?
In almost all cases, your early voting site is going to be different than your Election Day poll site.
On Election Day, coming up on the 8th, what do you want people to know? Later on in the show, we're going to be talking about security at the polls. Unfortunately, we find ourselves in a very divisive time politically. What do you want people to know as they head to the polls as far as what state law allows and how people can approach them as they're going in to cast a ballot?
Well, first and foremost, if they want to check their voter registration information, they can go to our website, which is elections.my.gov, and they can look up their information. That will tell them that they're registered, where they're registered, what their poll site is. For Tuesday, the hours are going to be 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. everywhere in the state, so there's plenty of time to vote. I think some of this stuff about election security is a little overblown here in New York State, but for our poll sites, the people who should be in a poll site are the poll workers or the inspectors, the voters, and anyone who is an accredited poll watcher. So the only people who can give a credential to a poll watcher under New York State law are the political parties or a specific candidate. And if you are a poll watcher and you go to a poll site, you should expect the inspectors to ask you for your credential, which you should be able to provide, and that gives you a right to be in the poll site. So under New York law, watchers can challenge voters if they feel that they have a reason to challenge a voter. That could be, if they have a list from the party of people who maybe died recently and they might still be on the polls. If someone shows up to vote for them and the poll watchers list says this person was deceased, they can challenge them. The poll workers have a process that they go through. It's a series of oaths, a verification oath, a qualification oath. And if the voter swears that they are who they say they are, they'll be able to vote. But if the voter says, no, I'm not interested in taking any of those oaths, then something's fishy, and they should be given an affidavit ballot or denied the right, or they should be given an affidavit ballot, which which would come back to the central board and be processed and more than likely not be counted because the voter refused the oaths that are part of the statute. So other rules with regard to poll watchers are, yes, they have a right to be there and they are part of the process. But if they're being disruptive, then they've overstepped their boundaries under the law. And, an example of something that might be disruptive is if you're a poll watcher and you decide that you're going to start taking pictures of voters as they're voting and the voters don't want to have their picture taken, but you continue to do it, then the inspector should have you removed from the poll site. And they should deal with it right there. Any activity that's happening in a poll site on election day, the person you go to is the inspector in the poll site. They're the ones who are going to control the poll site for that day, even if it's a private business or a school or something like that. For that day, it belongs to the elections board, so they have the say over who's in there and who's not there, and anyone being disruptive should be removed from the poll site.
Good to know. And for those heading out to the polls, John, on Tuesday that may need a little extra help completing a ballot, what is available to them?
Well, New York has some of the most advanced voting machines in the country, and both machines. We have two different vendors in New York State. We have ES&S and Dominion. ES&S has a machine called the AutoMark that's there to help voters with special needs. There's a screen for deaf voters. There's tactile device for the visually impaired. There's also a sip and puff device for someone who may have manual dexterity issues. Those are all part of the system. And the ImageCast is the other machine, and they have similar features to assist any voter who needs special needs. And the poll workers are trained in how these machines operate, so they should be able to assist any voter who needs anything.
And again, if anybody runs into any kind of trouble as far as asking for that help, they can reach right out to their local Board of Elections and express that concern?
They can, yes.
All right, John.
Every board has a website. It's full of good information, including the contact information for the local Board of Elections. One other thing I would mention is that for the ballot this year, there's a statewide ballot prop for the Environmental Quality Bond Act. So you should turn over your ballot because the ballot prop may be on the back. And in addition, depending on where you vote, there might be some local props in addition to the statewide. There's the one statewide, but there might be local props on your ballot. So make sure you turn over your ballot. There should be an arrow in the corner telling you to turn over your ballot, but just to be aware of that when you're in the poll site.
John Conklin, New York State Board of Elections. Great information there, John. Thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Sure, no problem.
All right, as Election Day nears, New York's gubernatorial candidates making their final pitches to voters. How well are those pitches working? Well, we're going to break down recent polling as Governor Hochul looks to maintain her edge over Lee Zeldin's challenge. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson here in Albany. The voter approval poll from Pix 11 News, Emerson College Polling, and The Hill shows that Kathy Hochul is widening her lead over Lee Zeldin with undecided voters. The poll was taken just last week, with Hochul leading over Zeldin 52 to 44%. When undecided voters were asked to choose, Hochul's lead increased to 54% of the vote compared to Zeldin's 45%. Now, regarding issues, 35% voted the economy as their top issue here. 13% said crime, 11% said abortion access. And we're pleased, as always, to be joined by Ayanna Harry, reporter with Pix 11 down in New York City, for some additional details on that poll. Ayanna, hello.
Hi, thank you for having me back.
Of course. So let's talk about this. This race, I think, for at least a lot of Democrats, is narrower than they thought, even though the latest poll shows that Governor Hochul is kind of edged out a few more points. What are you hearing from folks on the ground there in the city?
Sure. So folks on the ground here in the city, what they're concerned about right now is early voter turnout. We're looking at the early voter numbers so far, and the early voter turnout is certainly lower than what we saw back in 2020. Now, you have to keep in mind, 2020 was a time when, people were voting in a presidential election. There was incentive to vote early because of the pandemic, but Democrats are worried here in New York City because New York is really a Democratic base. Kathy Hochul needs Democratic voters to show up for her. And so far, early voter turnout is lower, and some have taken that as an indication that Democrats aren't tuned into this race, that they're not enthusiastic, that they're not going out and voting early for Kathy Hochul. So it is some concern for Hochul's camp, but our most recent polls did show the governor with an 8 percentage point lead over Lee Zeldin. She was at 52%. Zeldin was at 44%. So it's close. But Hochul does still have some room here.
And do you think maybe do the Democrats feel maybe some of their voters are just taking it for granted, considering they outnumber Republicans so much in the state? And New York, let's face it, hasn't elected a Republican governor in some 20 years since George Pataki back in 2002. So she had a lot of firepower with her recently, too, with Vice President Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton stumping with her down there in the city just the other day.
She did, but this was really one of the first larger rallies that we've seen for Kathy Hochul. Lee Zeldin has hosted large rallies throughout the state, including right here in New York City, but Kathy Hochul really hasn't fired up her base in large numbers. And so that some Democrats are attributing that to sort of the lower voter turnout, that perhaps some Democrats here in New York City may not even be aware that there's a gubernatorial election happening very, very soon. And if they are aware, they haven't seen the governor out, really campaigning aggressively, going to subway stations every day, having those large rallies. And so perhaps Democrats just aren't aware of the election or aren't fired up to show up for Kathy Hochul.
The last poll also showing that 35% of voters, their number one issue going into the election is the economy. However, when we look at least one of Lee Zeldin's most famous campaign ads, not recently, so recently this campaign season, focusing on crime, showing a lot of video. He took a little bit of backlash for some of the video he shared in that campaign spot. A lot of it seemed to focus on crime in and around New York City. Is that an issue for folks there more so than it has been across, say, the upstate regions?
It has been, but I will say this, Lee Zeldin has made his campaign almost a single issue campaign where he continues to talk about crime over and over again. In fact, I asked him about it, and he said the reason why he will continue to primarily speak about crime is because the issue is so urgent. But as you mentioned, more voters said that the economy was their number one issue than any other issue. So as Lee Zeldin continues to talk about crime, it may not resonate with voters in the way in which he may want it to, because they're really focused on the economy. And right now here in New York City, we just got recent new crime stats out, and murders and shootings continue to drop. Violent crime continues to drop here in New York City by significant numbers. So yes, Lee Zeldin is focused on crime, but right now New Yorkers here in the city and throughout the state, they're telling us that the economy is really what they are focused on. And perhaps that may be one of the factors as to why Lee Zeldin plateaued in our last few polls. He did not pick up any new support as he continues to focus on crime.
And of course, that small percentage of those undecided voters is really who both camps are trying to sway here as we head into these final days and hours before Tuesday.
Yeah, and when we asked undecided voters, 3% of them, to select a candidate, Kathy Hochul actually increases her lead over Lee Zeldin to a 9 percentage point lead. So again, this is good news for Kathy Hochul, but Lee Zeldin, he is still fighting until the very end. He's holding campaign rallies all throughout the state, large rallies here in New York City, which we traditionally do not see from Republicans. And Lee Zeldin is saying he's going to surprise people across the state with the amount of Republican support that he picks up here in New York City.
Finally, what are some of the other big issues? And I know even threats to democracy. A lot of people still saying that the 2020 election was illegitimate. There's a lot of people out there concerned about possible intimidation at the polls during these midterms. Is that a concern for folks that you've spoken to?
Absolutely. Right after the economy, threats to democracy was the second most popular answer that people gave us in terms of the issue that's driving them to the polls. And I want to also mention that abortion, that has been such a highlighted and vocal debate here in New York State that actually fell under crime. So although there's been so much talk about crime and abortion, that doesn't seem to be the two biggest issues that are on the minds of voters ahead of Election Day. It's really the economy and threats to democracy.
Pix 11's Ayanna Harry, thank you as always. Nice to see you.
Great to see you. Take care.
All right. Law enforcement across the nation is on alert heading into Election Day this year. Hear from one official on the steps law enforcement can take to protect voters from political violence and how they're handling those who may choose to intimidate voters. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson here in Albany. At the national level, law enforcement and government officials are working to address voter and poll worker intimidation concerns. Some areas of the country are seeing a growing trend of self-appointed so-called, quote, poll watchers. These people will dress in military-style clothing, cover their faces. They are armed. According to law enforcement, they may be working to discourage and intimidate voters or pressure election officials to change results. One official believes the increase in these incidents is being driven by misinformation that is spread across social media. All right, here now to give us a better understanding of the law enforcement response on Election Day, we're joined by Albany County Sheriff Craig Apple. Sheriff Apple, thanks so much for giving us some time.
Thanks for having me.
So unfortunately, we live in a very, very divisive time politically at the moment. There have been a lot of concerns all around the country. We've heard about folks out in Arizona and elsewhere who have taken it upon themselves to call themselves poll watchers. These are armed individuals wearing technical law enforcement gear, covering their faces, standing outside either a ballot drop box or some sort of polling location. How big of concern is it here in New York, and have you been privy to any kind of statewide conversations as far as how this is going to be handled on Tuesday?
We've been involved in a lot of conversations statewide, nationally, and of course locally. There's no perceived threat or any indication that that is going to happen or go on anywhere near Albany County, let alone New York. Nor would we allow that to happen. That is in violation of an abundance of laws. I can tell you that locally, during early voting, we've had deputies out every single day and every single evening, constantly checking on the polling places. Now, please keep in mind that during early voting, there's only a few strategic locations in the county that we, have to be concerned with. But then next week on Election Day, we will have, I think at our last count was roughly 39 deputy sheriffs out checking polling places. We check them every single hour. The deputy that has that zone has to call in, identify the polling place, and then we mark down that it was checked. We look for things like electioneering, people handing out, palm cards or whatever, too close to the building, things like that, sign station too close, a crowd in the voting booth or in the voting gymnasium, wherever they may have their the ballots. So we deal hand in glove with Board of Elections, and they alert us to anything. We have a radio system set up at Board of Elections. We identify where there's a problem. They have a small army there within minutes.
Right. And, you talk about the laws here specific to New York State, and it's true. Even if you're a legitimate member of a campaign, there's a certain amount of distance you have to maintain on Election Day from those polls.
That's correct. You got to be 100 feet away. And, usually that person's opponent knows exactly what that 100 feet mark is. Yeah. And they usually put a sign up to indicate that, nothing from this point on. So listen, I know that there's a lot of angst. There's a lot of anxiety out there this year. There's a lot of negativity being thrown all over our airwaves. I wish that never happened. I always tell everybody, just run on your record or what you can do for for your constituents, and keep the negativity out of it, because that's what drives a lot of issues. People see this and they get a grievance and they're like, oh my God, they said this, and and then they want to retaliate or something to that effect. But I'm very confident that we have security well under control. There's been no threats, nothing to that effect. We're constantly doing threat assessment analysis. We're constantly dealing with our federal partners. And some people want there to be fear because they think that's just another form of voter suppression. So we don't see any issues. Fair, safe elections. That's part of our democracy. That is the fabric of our democracy. And everybody, we want to go out and exercise your right to vote. And I see no reason whatsoever why people can't do that.
And real quick, should anybody come across anything when they're at the polls on Tuesday, or even while they're still early voting up until today, should they reach out to their local, wherever they are in the state, reach out to their local law enforcement, whoever is there keeping an eye on things, just let them know?
Yeah, well, I don't know who is handling elections outside of our county. We do it in Albany County. I would advise them, if they see something suspicious or whatever, immediately dial 911. I mean, that's what we always tell everybody. If you see something, say something. So use the emergency 911 to advise somebody.
All right.
And if there's an officer right there, just alert them and they can deal with it immediately. But again, I see no threats. I've heard of no threats. we will not have armed people that are not law enforcement at polling places. We will not allow that. That will not happen. It is in violation of numerous New York State laws. And again, we don't want anybody to fear coming out and vote. Please come out and exercise your right to vote.
Albany County Sheriff Craig Apple, as always, we thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great day.
All right, stick around. We're going to be right back with a look at the week ahead in just a moment. Remember, if you've got a comment, story idea, please let us know. Email Empire State Weekly or find us on Twitter. Finally, from us here on Empire State Weekly, as we look ahead to next week, elections will be in the rear view. But will the fallout from these consequential midterms, what will it be? We'll bring you the results from the big races, of course, and what they will mean for the state moving forward. But for now, from all of us here on Empire State Weekly, I'm Ryan Peterson in Albany. We'll see you right back here next week. And don't forget, you can catch Empire State Weekly all over the state of New York. Here is our full schedule of where you can find us on 10 television stations across the state.